Welcome to everybody to the Northeast Park Hill Mobility Meeting. Public meeting is first kind of in a series of a few meetings here talking about a few mobility projects in Northeast Park Hill area. And thank you for taking the time to come out this evening. Thank you. We've got about an hour and a half and we're going to try and get you out of here a little bit early, depending on how many questions you all ask. But thank you also. We've got members of Council District 8 here in attendance, so thank you as well. Some orientation to kick you off here. We've got the meeting set up in Teams, which I know people aren't quite as familiar with. So first note, I guess, is that we're recording. You probably see that note at the top of the screen. We're going to post this on the website afterwards. You're welcome to watch it again if you want to remind yourself what happened or pass it on to your neighbors. So Teams buttons and functions that some of them you have the capability, some not. There's the mic on and off and camera on and off, and that's probably grayed out for you. But there's the chat function you can see in that I've put a purple arrow to. And that's one of the primary ways we're going to get input tonight. And so if you click on that little button, it'll pull up a panel so you can see all the chats. Opportunities for input throughout. We're going to be answering things in the Q&A breaks, but also potentially in the chats as we go, if they're kind of simpler questions. Also note that if you're having bandwidth issues, there's an option in the 3 dots pull down menu up at the top that says turn off incoming video. And that'll help if we're kind of getting choppy or something like that. Reminder too, as you post in the chat as we go along, that you're with your neighbors and your friends and everybody's here to try and make this area better. So please be civil. Make sure you're kind of truly listening if there are differing opinions out there. Lastly, here we have, after the meeting, we have a website and an email listed, and we'll pull those back up again at the end of the meeting. So I know that we have at least one person on via phone, so we'll try and make sure we're describing these slides well, and just a reminder that that's why we're doing it. So, okay, next one. So I want to give you a little bit of an overview of where we're going with this meeting. First, we'll go through intros and then give you a little bit of background on how these projects came about and talk about some existing conditions data we've collected so far. But the main point of this meeting is really to give us feedback. It's a listening session. We want your feedback, your ideas, and your input. Like I said before, there will be multiple opportunities throughout with chat, Q&A, and we'll even give you a few minutes to start the survey that we're going to kind of send home with you. And then other inputs that you can give us toward the end. And we have somebody who's noting that they can't hear anything, so we'll have our IT folks start looking at that. And the next slide, if you move on one more. First I wanted to say about the input, we do recognize you've already thought a lot about this area, and we want to respect that you've done some previous plans that Dottie wasn't really in the lead on, and take those studies and the input you've provided there and combine it with what we hear tonight moving forward. So don't think that we've forgotten about those. And with that, I'd like to introduce your city team. This is Dottie, which is Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. Team of planners, designers, and engineers who've been working really hard on this project and in this area of Denver. So first we have the planning leads, Riley and David. You'll hear from them during the meeting here. And a community designer who's basically a liaison that tries to keep abreast of what's going on in this area. And that's Dana. You'll also hear from her. And then the project managers for the actual projects we'll talk about today are Steve and Adam. They're here as well if we have some questions for them. And then Hadar is the engineer lead on all the projects that we'll talk today. So thank you for being here, and we'll kick it off with Dana.
Thanks, Alicia. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening. We know your time is precious, so we really appreciate you giving us feedback on this. I'm going to take just a couple minutes to help sort of lay the context of how we got here and why we're talking to you about these roads and these projects today. And to start with, I guess it's sort of no secret to any of you all that Denver has been growing for the last couple decades. And as the city grows, our roadways end up sort of pulling double and triple duty as we try to move more people in the same amount of space. So Dottie, so our staff is basically tasked with figuring out how to move people more efficiently. In the past, we mostly used single occupancy vehicles, but to move people more efficiently over time, we're going to have to re-envision our roadways to some extent so that we can still get people around and give people choices to move around in a way that works best for them. We can move on to the next slide here. So in order to help us achieve sort of that goal of making sure that our roadways continue to function well, we have some pretty big mobility goals that we're working to achieve. And some of those relate to that kind of choice, letting people walk, bike, drive their car, use transit, share. We also want to make sure those roads stay safe for everybody, and also make sure that we can make sure our air is clean and that we're achieving our climate goals as well. So we have some sort of big goals that we need to achieve along the way. One of those goals I just mentioned is the safety goal. And I want to highlight this specifically because we have a Vision Zero goal. It's a big part of our bottom line. And that Vision Zero goal is essentially to have 0 fatalities from our roadways by 2030. But the last decade, that number has unfortunately been going the other direction. So you can see from the bar chart that we've had a growing number of fatalities related to our roadways over the last couple years. So we are working very hard to find ways to make sure our roads are safer. And we can move on to the next slide here. Dottie, our staff, is a really big part of that, right? So we manage the infrastructure in the right-of-way, ROW, the right-of-way. So we look at the pedestrian realm, what's in the roadway itself, where people are driving their cars, all the way up to sort of the frontage line where private property starts. And our streets are a really big opportunity to make those things safer. And we need to use a lot of creativity to make sure that there's space for all of the users, so we can provide the choice for how they get around, but also make sure that all those users getting around in different ways are safe. And the projects we're going to talk about today actually are some of those creative ways that can provide both greater mobility and safety. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But before we do that, I'm going to step back again and talk a little bit about how we got to these projects. Obviously, we as a department depend on the community to help guide where we're going to go. Luckily, we have some really community-led, robust plans that are help guiding where projects are most needed and where we need to make sure that our mobility is improved. Some of those you've probably heard of. They've been adopted in just the last couple years. So documents like Blueprint Denver, the Vision Zero Action Plan, and then we also have documents like Denver Moves, which get down a little bit more into the details in our work about transportation. And in addition to these sort of big citywide plans, we're also aware of some other big projects that are coming to Northeast Denver. One of those is the golf cart study. We're not going to talk about that in a great deal of detail, but we are keeping an eye on that. And then another is sort of the 303 Artway study and program. And this is your led, so stakeholder-led project, but has been something that we've been watching. And we see the recommendations that you have in that project. Some of those recommendations, like improving lighting, are things that we need to continue to look for, identifying new funding sources. But other of these things, like sidewalk gap filling, improving the pedestrian experience, and bike lanes, as well as signal timing. So some of these other recommendations we're actively working on, and we have projects that are moving forward right now in Northeast Park Hill to help address some of those things. So while we're mostly here to talk about bikeways in specific locations, we have a bunch of other things ongoing. And this is a little overwhelming, but I just want to point to some things that are that are happening around Northeast Denver as well. We could answer questions about these for ages, so you can always contact me after. But essentially, we have quite a few sidewalk gap efforts and projects that are moving forward. Many of those could be constructed by the end of this year. Well, we moved to the map of the same information. So we have sidewalks. We've also been able to conduct a study of Colorado Boulevard and are looking at both speeds and potential signal retiming at 4 major intersections. And we are rebuilding a signal right now at MLK, and that gives us an opportunity to enhance the safety and pedestrian experience there. And then sort of moving down the legend here on this map, you can see that on the very bottom, we have roadway repaving. And those are showing in pink and red, and or that sort of, what is that color? Brownish color. And these are just this year or next year repaving projects. And these give us an opportunity to help do some other projects at the same time, along with the bikeway projects. So I'm going to highlight the number 2 is another project that is moving forward in Northeast Park Hill, and number 3 as well. But we'll have other opportunities to talk about those. But what we're focused on today are the Northeast Park Hill bike lane projects. So if we can move to the next slide. I wanted to step back and said that a couple the paving projects give us an opportunity to do bikeways. And you're probably thinking, what the heck does that mean? And it helps to understand that DOTI gets its work done using different funding sources and different programs. And for instance, signals are a very costly but very important update. And because we have a limited signal funding bucket, we often have to prioritize that funding for all across the city and think about where the needs are greatest and where we have the most equity needs. So we use that signal budget for that. But similarly, we have other programs to help us accomplish other improvements in the right of way. And paving, moving to the next slide, paving is something that happens year over year. So our paving crews work to get almost the whole city repaved in less than a decade. Usually it's 5 or 6 years we have repaved the whole city. So each year we're actually repaving 400 to 500 miles of roadway. That's a lot of roadway. And what it does is it gives us a unique opportunity to accomplish some other projects that just require restriping the roadway at the same time. That way we don't have to do expensive and sort of destructive processes to remove old striping lines and can put in new striping and new facilities at the same time as we do paving. And the projects that we're here to talk to you about today are like that. They're using that paving that's happening in Northeast Park Hill to actually put in that bike infrastructure that we know is needed from the plans that I talked to you about earlier. So here they are highlighted, the specific bikeways we're all here to talk about today. Well, we're going to get into the details. You don't have to write this down. We're going to get into the details of what the segments are and how long they are and such. But I want to answer also the important question of why we're even putting bike lanes down. So if we move to the next slide, yeah, why bike lanes? Well, for some folks, this is obvious. For others, it's not. What we find from doing polls of Denverites and from those plans and the interviews from different neighborhoods, we know that pretty consistently across every neighborhood, most Denverites have some interest in being able to bike around, but that most bicyclists actually don't feel safe riding on our streets today. So when we put down a bicycle lane, we actually create a specific space for them. And that is the bottom line, to help people feel more comfortable using their bicycle as a choice to get around. And that's why we're here talking about that today. All right, so moving forward here to the next slide. We're gonna dive into the details of each of these streets and what we're thinking about in terms of putting bike lanes on them in just a couple minutes. But I threw a lot of information out there, and we wanted to offer up the opportunity for questions and to get started with that survey that Alicia mentioned. So I'm going to open it up. Remember, you can use that chat box to start entering any questions or comments you have right now.
Thank you, Dana. We'll have just 3 or 4 minutes here for questions. And before, or as people are still entering them to the chat, I've got 1 or 2 questions, and I think Dana, you could answer one. The first one is, you talked a little bit about bikeways, the term bikeways, and can you define that a little bit better about what exactly a bikeway is versus a bike lane?
Yeah, I can answer that right away. That's sort of a generic term we use. There are different types of bike facilities that look slightly different across the city. So bikeways is that generic term to encompass all the different types of bike facilities, whether that's a path or what we call buffered bikeway or a regular bike lane. So that's why we tend to use that generic term. Today, we're going to be focusing on bike lanes for these roads. Great. I hope that helps.
Yeah, we've got a good question too, I think, for Riley about how the plans decide which type of facilities for which streets. But the question is, what criteria are used to select the streets that will be paved? Oh, that's, sorry, to be paved. I read that wrong. So the paving program.
I can probably take a shot at that too. Riley's talking on mute, so I just ran him over. So paving is done, like I said, we're trying to get a lot of paving done in a given year. And there are a lot of different factors that they consider when they decide which areas to pave. The most nominal reason is streets that haven't been paved in a while and how much wear and tear they've gotten. So some streets get more than others, just depending on how much traffic flows over them. But then they also have some sort of like logistical considerations where they want to do chunks of roadway at the same time. That works more efficiently for their crews. And then there's some other things like weather considerations and how far the concrete is going from one place to another. So they take those all into account and try to make sure that we're hitting up all of the city in an equitable fashion year over year. So that's the big picture of how we choose locations to pave. And then we look at opportunities like these bikeways to put in with them year over year also.
One follow-up question for you on that, Dana, on the paving program specifically, a little unrelated to the bikeways. Do the ADA corners, get upgraded when the paving program comes through?
Unfortunately, that's not usually the case just for a repaving. We do have an entirely different program of folks who go out and install about 1,500 new ADA ramps every year. But repaving is a separate program. If you do have a specific sort of location where you or others are struggling to get around, you can contact us to ask for a specific location to be put in. But typically, they're not all going to be put in when we repave a bunch of roadways.
Cool. All right, Riley, here's the question I was originally asking you. Somebody asked it in a different way here. Somebody asked about what input went into the plans that are kind of creating or discussing these bikeways. Specific question was, how widely was the community surveyed? But maybe you can, Riley can talk about how those plans were developed. And Dana, you're welcome to add on as well. Is Riley on mute?
So just to answer that question, there was a number of, for the Denver Moves Bicycles plan that was done in 2011, and that was done through wide community outreach that met with a lot of different people and members in the Denver community to understand what the future bike network would look like. And that was just one plan. I also want to emphasize that there was additional planning efforts that have gone into it besides just that. Denver Moves Bicycles was updated again in 2015, and then also through Blueprint Denver, which had was a vast community effort to get as many voices as possible, was further incorporated some of these bikeway improvements into those plans as well.
Great, thank you. I want to do one more point here, and then we're going to move on to the survey, but I do see 3 or 4 different notes also of additional sidewalks and ADA considerations. And that reminded me to tell you that your chats, if we don't get a direct answer to them, or if they're building on other ones, they're being recorded, being taken down, and being jotted down, being transferred to our documentation. And we will, anything with specific questions, we will reply to in the meeting documentation on the website afterwards. So don't think if we don't get a specific direct answer to you right away that it's being ignored. Certainly will be considered as we move forward with the design process. So if we want to move on to the next slide here, and we'll have 3 more Q&A sessions as well. So, keep the questions coming, but I want to wait on the what will this look like type questions until the next phase. So we're trying something a little bit different this virtual public meeting, which we've been doing these virtual public meetings for almost a year. And this is the first time we're going to try this. We have this survey, and I'll give you the website in a second for those who are on the phone, that will stay open for the next 2 weeks. But for those folks who are here in this meeting, this would almost be like giving us your direct input immediately in a public meeting that you were here with us in person. So I'm going to leave it open until 6:29. Be back at 6:29. If you can go to bit.ly/N Park Hill Survey, North Park Hill Survey, but with an N. And you can see it here, and start filling out that survey. It's there, it covers all 3 quarters we're going to talk about, and it kind of asks how you currently use them, that type of thing. So if you can go to that website right now, start filling out the survey. It's okay if you don't finish it, but if you can finish it, that way we can get a little bit more data as we move on with this meeting. So you can also get up and take a real quick break if you need to get more tea or whatever, but we'll be back here at 6:29.
Hey, Alicia, this is David. And for those on the phone, I do believe Bitly links are case sensitive. So you might want to, it's capital N, capital P for park, capital H Hill, and capital S survey, and Park Hill survey.
All right, if you have your sound still on, we've got just 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we'll have you come back to the meeting. I feel like a exam proctor here. All right, I've got 6:29. Pencils down. Was anybody able to, I guess I can't ask you, if you let me know in the chat if you were able to complete the survey, and we'll keep an eye on it too as we go throughout to see if we can get the input from it during the meeting. So thank you for coming on back to the meeting here. Yeah, sounds like folks probably can't finish them all, which makes sense. They take about 3 to 4 minutes per corridor, and there are 3 a corridor. So it's okay if you're not finished, and you can go back and finish it later tonight. Like I said, they will be open for 2 weeks. So thank you for starting on those. So next thing, we're just going to move into some of the existing conditions and moving into talking about what each of these 3 corridors might look like and get your feedback on them. Let's start off with David here. Thanks.
Thanks, Alicia. Everyone hear me okay? Great. All right. So thanks, everybody. And really, again, appreciate your time. And as soon as you have a question, something comes to mind, please put it in the chat. If whether it's a comment, question, we'll do our best to get you information as quickly as possible. So I'm going to talk to you today about 2 projects, about North Dahlia and then East 35th. So first, with North Dahlia, just want to show the context of where we're actually going to be repaving. So we're going to be repaving the street between 39th and 35th. And one of the questions we get a lot is, why this street, and why here, why not a block over? And so for one, the street gives us good connections between our existing and also the future bike projects. So obviously you'll note that little detour there. And another question is, why are you doing the detour? And if those who are not familiar with the land use there next to the golf course, there is some private property issue, and the street actually doesn't go all the way through at the moment. So, this definitely doesn't preclude that in the future, but for right now, we do have to do a little detour around the property. Next slide, please. So getting into a little bit more about the project. So people when they're on their bikes are just like people when they walk or take transit or drive their car. They want to get to some place, and to help promote and make the bicycle a viable choice, we have to get them to connect to other bikeways. In most cases, they won't be able to take Dahlia all the way to where they want to go. They're probably going to have to get on another road. So in this case, in the south, it's going Dahlia can connect us to the Bruce Randolph Bikeway, and up to the north, future bikeways too that will be implemented at a later date. So right now, it gives us good connectivity and building out that network. And a good balanced network that's not too far apart is the first part in making a bicycle a viable option and alternative to taking another mode, even your car. So just giving people good connectivity. And this is what Dahlia looks like today. A screenshot there. We have 2 12-foot travel lanes going in either direction with parking. And right now it's just a dashed yellow line. And when there's cars parked on the side or not cars parked on the side, it looks like a really wide, it can look like a really wide roadway, which is can be conducive to speeding. So we hope that this project can assist with that. The Dahlia's measurements change as you go. In some places it's 36 feet wide, and then it widens up even more to 40 feet wide, which is a pretty wide stretch of roadway for just 2 lanes of traffic. So there's, yeah, that's fine. So, and also, as Dana mentioned earlier, there have been some crashes along this stretch of corridor. There's been 20 vehicle crashes in the last 5 years, and we believe that's too many, and we're trying to reduce that. And vehicle crashes are often symptomatic of other issues in the area, whether that's speeding or sight issues, or people just not having a clear idea of what type of behavior is expected in an area because the roads can be so wide. So really hoping that this project can help address some of those concerns. This is part of also our study in trying to collect information about the roadway is doing a parking study. And our typical practice is to collect parking data and information when we anticipate that it will be at its highest use. So usually, at 5:30 in the morning on a weekday, and when most people haven't left for work yet, when most people would be parking, and then in a weekend morning, and then the midday weekday. Now, what's important to note about this is if we really rely on your feedback and context, and if there's a business or a religious facility or some type of land use that has particularly high use for parking, that's something we want to know about. So please let us know, because sometimes there's just those scenarios where we may have missed it. So please let us know if there's a situation where we didn't collect parking at when it would be its highest use. But what this does show us is that parking isn't being utilized very heavily along the corridor. Overall, it's relatively light usage. So as Dana, and we got a question about what a bikeway is, or what are bikeways. So we're talking about a striped bike lane. In this picture on the left, you see is what we're looking at is just a white stripe with painted symbols, and there's signs that we put up, and what those can do is then again designate space for bicyclists, designate space for cars, and it really helps us target that larger percent of the population who don't feel comfortable riding on the street as it exists right now. So we're going to stop there and pause for questions, and please let us know if you have any questions or comments as it pertains to Dahlia.
All right, I do see a note here about some of those buildings, David, that you were talking about, particularly in this case, some churches at Dahlia and 38th. So good to have that information that we'll include later. And I do also want to respond to one that was, Hadar, you may be able to respond to this about disaggregated data associated with the bike lanes in the future, whether that data might be available kind of in its simplest forms rather than in our presentation format here. And I don't know the answer to that. Hadar, I'm not sure if you know the answer to that either, but take a crack at it if you do.
I'm not sure about that either. I can look into breaking it down to a more simplified form.
And then I get my follow-up would be if the individual who commented on the church, if that's Sunday 9:30 time is the right time to collect, and we can obviously reach out to the church, but if that sounds like the right time, you could let us know as well.
Okay. And also a note here about the fact that there are other corridors in the area that are, seeing changes as well. And so to make sure, in this case, it was about the churches and the impact of MLK, changes. And so to make sure that we consider the changes, not just on these three corridors, which is certainly a good point.
That's a great point. To take a network perspective is really important.
Okay, cool. Well, I think we've gotten most of the current questions for now, so I think we can probably move on to the next quarter.
Great.
Oh, and actually, David, just to interrupt you before we go, I do see that we have about 14 answers on the survey, so thank you for answering those. And the most interesting thing on that I see initially right away is just the two questions about how do you typically travel on this street, and we have a majority of drivers on this street here. About 60% of them drive, about 80–90% of them drive, and 60% walk and roll. And then the second one is about what activities you typically use the street for, and the highest use was to commute through. And then there's also a significant amount of recreational use on this as well. So it's two interesting points.
Great. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Alicia. All right, guys. Well, now we're going to talk about East 35th between Dahlia and Quebec. So yeah, so this will be a great project, and so something that we're also trying to do that we are getting better at is doing projects not just in isolation, but doing them in a bundle. Because when we can do them together, where we are actually making a network. And in this instance, we have a great opportunity to do Dahlia, which connects to East 35th, and then also Holly as well. So this is a really great opportunity for us. But you can see the project extents. So it's going to provide some pretty significant east-west mobility through the neighborhood. And again, some of the talking points and what makes a road a potentially good candidate for a bike lane is that it connects to existing and proposed facilities. It also connects to parks and schools and places that people want to go to. So it really does make a bike lane not just a street for recreation, but a place to solve a transportation problem, or where you want to get somewhere and you don't want to have to use your car. Now you can use this bike lane to get here. So really a great opportunity to improve the network in Northeast Park Hill. So again, this is what East 35th looks like right now. Speed limit 25 miles per hour, 2 10-foot travel lanes, and then an 8-foot undesignated but informally a parking lane on either side of the street. So you're gonna digging into the crash data a little bit. It's pretty significant actually on this corridor. There's been in the past 5 years, there's been almost 100 crashes. So we're looking at 20 crashes every year. So almost a crash and a half every month. That's pretty significant. And unfortunately, two bicycle crashes and 4 pedestrian crashes. So those can be indicative of a lot of different issues. Some of the issues you guys have previously identified through the 303 Art Walk, like improvements for street lighting can certainly help with that. And then also painting and designated travel lanes on the road also helps with that. You think if you think like of how you drive on I-25, you don't think too much, or I-70, but those lanes are very wide because which is to facilitate going at a high speed, and that's essentially what happens when you leave a street undesignated over a certain distance, and it makes the street just more conducive to speeding. So that's something that we can improve here by designating travel lanes. It has a natural traffic calming effect, and hopefully get us towards our Vision Zero goals here. So again, this for East 35th, we are talking about a bike lane, a striped bike lane. So no other elements in the roadway except a white line and the bike stencil, and then signs. If you can see, actually, just in that little top right-hand corner, we will also put bike lane signs too to help remind people to know that this is a bike lane. So again, we'll pause here and see if there are any questions or comments, things we should specifically know about 35th, other things we should look at. I want to also mention that when we do these paving projects and work with the community, it's also an opportunity for us to identify really quick win solutions, things that, whether it's like, trimming back trees or, improving the sight distance of a stop sign, or a crosswalk that needs refreshing. These are opportunities to, while we're out there in the neighborhood, to work on it. So please let us know if there's other things that we can do, and in some instances they can be a really quick turnaround, and we can get these in when we're doing the project.
Thanks, David. I think the first question on this one will be for you, back at you, about parking. And the question is about where residents along the way are going to park if parking modifications occur.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess we don't have the parking information on the slide for this one. But it's anticipated that people would park in their driveways, garages, or if they have back alley access to their property, that's where they would park, or adjacent side streets.
Okay. And also a note about whether speed dips were taking into consideration to slow traffic. And I'm not sure if that question is about
speed.
installing speed dips or existing speed dips that are out there.
Sure. So I can, I mean, I can mention, well, so speed humps are a relatively new, that were just recently approved. And we have some pretty defined criteria along that, but can certainly examine this and examine the speeds. I think our first step here would be to install the bike lane and to see how that impacts speeds. But certainly having speed humps in our toolbox is good. And if there's a pervasive speeding problem, it's something we can definitely explore at another date. If it's existing speed dips, sometimes with our irrigation and, at intersections, sometimes it actually functions as a natural traffic calming device. And those would likely still be the same. It won't dramatically change the grade of the roadway when the road surface is improved.
And just to note that those those dips, I guess, you're talking about are probably what we would consider drainage pans going across. They're in the road for drainage,
Right.
But they absolutely do impact the speeds. When the speed study is done, that's accommodated for because it's already out there when people are actually doing the study to see what the speeds are. So. And there was one question too here real quick about a study in the area between Monaco and Quebec. David, I think this one will be for you too. If you want to go back, Riley, to the slide showing the boundary of the study. The question is, what does that study entail? And I think that because 35th is one of our corridors that doesn't have as much existing data, maybe David, you can tell what we usually collect on a corridor when we get there.
So the question is, what sort of information do we collect when we study a corridor?
Yeah, or what does the study entail? Yeah.
Sure. So typically the information we're interested in is number of vehicles. So we would call that traffic volume, number of vehicles in a day. And then we also are interested in how fast those vehicles are going. We're also interested in if there's a percentage of those vehicles that happen to be heavy freight, because if there's a large percentage of freight vehicles, then that changes, impacts how the roadway is used. And we're also interested in crash data, historical crash data. Those are the sort of hard numbers we can actually measure and define. So that's typically the most important. And then when you actually get to like an intersection, we will then also look at turning movements, how frequently people are making left and right-hand turns. And that's pretty much the bulk of what we collect. We also will collect at intersection studies. We'll also collect pedestrian and bicycle counts. Those are more of a interesting to know, but they don't always define a certain outcome.
Thanks. I think there were a few questions on here about kind of different conditions where parking would be a concern. And one of them is with street sweeping, if you have to move to the other side or move to a different area and parking is impacted on one of the streets versus, and then I don't know if I've seen it on this one, but another one we get sometimes is about, trash containers and things like that. David, maybe that's another one for you.
Sure. So typically, what we do is we still allow people to, people can put their trash, on their sidewalk. They can put it in the bike lane, or they can put it, outside of the bike lane into the travelway. We don't recommend that. Typically the bike lanes as designed are wide enough for a bicyclist to maneuver around. safely, or that there's room for the trash can. But that is a great question, and we definitely work closely with our street maintenance team and our waste teams on that. And there are, if there are restrictions with parking or street cleaning, then we make sure that those times are clearly designated and can work with the community if there's some issues there regarding enforcement or whatever. But typically the design is generous enough to accommodate.
Great. There have been one or two more questions, and maybe we'll do this one as the last one and then move on. We'll keep following up on these Q&A in the next session we have. But maybe the last question here for this session, or for this Q&A, is about speed concerns regarding speeding. And the general consensus, we've seen a few people saying these speed dips are already mitigating the speeds along there, so that's great. David, you want to address whether this project may or may not propose additional speed mitigation, or just the idea of a bike lane as speed mitigation to start with?
Yeah, so I would think, definitely what we would do is, start with the bike lane, and just by narrowing the visual lane, the lane that the people can drive in, that does have a traffic calming effect. But if, there's some stubborn folks out there who are insist on speeding, we can certainly get out there and, collect more data. We can work with the police department to, get enforcement if the community feels like that is a viable option as well. But really, we want to, measure what we've done first. And if there's additional treatments, then, there's other things we can do with visual narrowing at the intersections, or even introducing, vertical elements that force people to slow down. But kind of want to take it as a step-by-step process, so that we're being thoughtful and really addressing the issue and where the issue is.
Great, thank you. Okay, and we do see the notes too, since this last one, about crosswalks and about potential parallel corridors, and as well concerns of speeding or of not speeding and putting in mitigation measures actually impacting the residents negatively. So we can get to those in the last session, and let's go ahead and move on to the third corridor with Riley.
All right, just wanted to confirm that you can hear me, Alicia. So this next project—
I can, sorry.
Okay, great. So this next project that I'm going to talk to you about is North Holly Street between East 48th and East 35th. Something that I want to say that's a little bit different about this project is the other ones that we've talked about, the majority of those streets are being repaved in 2021, so likely later this summer. This one's a little bit different in that only a small portion of it is being repaved this year, and that is a portion between East Smith Road and I-70. So we only expect that just a small portion will be repaved this year, and then the rest of the project will be repaved likely starting in 2022. So this one has a little bit of a different timeline than what we've talked about. Another key difference that I want to talk about is that what we've shown you before has mostly been striped bike lanes, and that is what's proposed on Holly Street between East 48th and East 38th. But then when you go south of 38th between East 38th and East 35th, we're looking at what's called the neighborhood bikeway, and that's a little bit different because it's not a dedicated space for people riding bikes. It's actually a shared condition between people driving and people riding bikes. And generally what we do on those kinds of streets are treatments such as marked crosswalks and intersection improvements that help people to be able to safely navigate the street. Some of the benefits of this particular project, again, just as David shared with some of the other ones, is that it does connect destinations, including the proposed bikeway network, but it's also important to note that there are a few schools along this corridor and as well as a park. So this again is providing a safe way to be able to connect to some of those different destinations. Just looking at what the conditions look like today, we have a couple of different land uses. As I mentioned before, we have a different type of project south of 35th, just because the land uses change and the roadway narrows as well. South of 35th, we're looking more at a residential condition, whereas north of that, it's a little bit more of industrial land uses. And so you'll notice on here that the cross section of the street changes a little bit. And so that's why our how we will think about this design will as well. And again, just kind of looking at between Smith Road and 42nd Avenue, again, looking at more industrial land uses, again, where you have kind of wide lanes, several travel lanes. And so these are things that we will be thinking about as we're trying to incorporate how we can safely move bicyclists on this corridor as well. Something that I want to note, and I know David touched on this with the two projects that he spoke about, but anytime prior to us designing a project, as David mentioned, we look and collect as much information as we can about the particular street, so that way we can make informed decisions when we're making a design. One of the important pieces of input, of course, is the input that we get from you as the community that helps to supplement. So we do really hope that you'll take the survey. That kind of information helps us to be able to understand where there are concerns and helps us to be able to inform the design. So the posted speed limits today, it actually changes. It's 25 when you get south of 35th, and then it's 30 in the northern segment. So far, our data is showing that the speeds are lower than on some of the other two corridors that we talked about. That could be because of construction that's happening, and so if the speeds that you observe as the community are a lot higher than this, that's something important to let us know about. In addition, we also look at crash data as well, just to be consistent with the Vision Zero goals. There has been a few bicycle and pedestrian related crashes that have occurred, notably closest to I-70 and then on 35th and where East Smith Road is. So again, one of the benefits of these types of projects is to give everybody a safe space to be in the road and to improve safety. We also did collect parking data between 35th and 48th. And again, this just helps us to understand how the corridor is being utilized from a parking perspective. And then going to the last slide before we jump into questions about Holly Street, as I mentioned, this is similar to Dahlia and 35th, where we're looking at a striped bike lane. But again, want to emphasize one more time between 38th and 35th that we are just looking at a neighborhood bikeway in this. So once it transitions to the residential land use, as you see between 38th and 35th, we're looking at not a striped bikeway, but instead a shared condition between people driving and people riding bikes. And again, we have the ability to make intersection improvements so that it makes it so that it's easier to get across the street and easier to navigate the intersections as someone who's riding a bike. So with that, I'm going to pause for questions on Holly Street.
Great. Thank you, Riley. I think we have some questions that have been coming in that kind of apply to all three. Okay. So one of the ones that came in with 35th, but that I think could apply to all three, is about pedestrian movement and crosswalks and improvements. So the question kind of has to do with whether pedestrian improvements are going in with these projects and whether there's an opportunity to request crosswalk locations.
I could answer.
I can take a shot at that, David. Yeah, so it is an opportunity to identify locations where you guys notice a lot of folks are crossing the street. So in some cases, we can install a crosswalk at the same time as we're putting in the striping for a bike lane. I would note that typically when we do look at those locations, so we want to get your feedback. If you could share which locations you really think a crosswalk would be of help. That's very useful information for us, because then we can go look at that intersection and see if it is a location that meets the standards for a crosswalk, and do the study to do that. And then in some cases, if it does meet that standard, we can go ahead and install it right with the project. So it is a good opportunity to let us know where those needs exist. So please do put that in the chat box or contact us after so we can identify those locations.
And a note that crossing any crossing challenges is one of the questions on the survey too. So while you're filling out the survey, that's another good place that you can put notes about places where crossing is a challenge. So I think we're going to send this one to David, and I did see some discussion about whether these modifications are going to change traffic patterns or going to increase traffic patterns. And really one of the speed concerns was less about can we reduce speeding and more about are the project impacts going, in order to help speeding, if it is even out there, going to negatively impact the community. So maybe we can talk about what vehicular impacts outside of parking these corridor changes may have. David?
Sure. So I mean, I would say I would definitely hope that these projects, by defining space on the road for people on bikes, actually increases the amount of people on bikes. So we hope we see an increase there. There isn't really academic research that says you putting a bike lane on the road increases people driving on that road. We do see research that shows when you visually narrow a place for people to drive, that it does reduce speeds. So in terms of things that would impact a driver, we do hope to see a reduced speeding where that's an issue. And you never want to rule it out. Maybe some people won't want to be on a road where there's an increase in bicyclist activity, and they'll choose another road. But there's not a ton of real in-depth research to show that would create any noticeable difference in the neighborhood.
And both for David and Riley, are any of these projects proposing removing a lane of traffic that would actually divert traffic just simply by volume standpoint?
No lane removal.
Right.
So.
Okay. There was another question about parallel routes, and this question was specifically about 35th, but I think that maybe Riley could take this one about the planning process and how you identify a specific route and when other parallel routes are considered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so happy to take that question. As we mentioned before, the planning process where there's a lot that went into it. This plan where some of these projects were identified came from both the 2011 Denver Moves Bicycles plan that was then updated again in 2015. So that's where those projects were initially identified. And how those streets were identified in the first place during that planning process is through a number of different factors. And so there's actually a lot that we look at when we're choosing a facility or when we're choosing a roadway that makes sense to have a bike way. Obviously, one of the things is we're looking at connectivity. So just as David mentioned before, people riding bikes are similar to people driving vehicles. They have places that they're trying to get to as well. So we'll look at roads that connect to the larger road network. That's one of the things that we'll look at. Another thing, though, that we'll look at is also the condition, or I should say character of the roadway. So again, because we look at things like speeds and volumes and that kind of thing to determine which roads are suitable to have people riding bikes on. And then if that road if there's maybe not another alternative to pick a roadway to improve for biking, and there's high speeds or there's high volumes, sometimes we'll do things to kind of discourage speeding. And so there's a lot of different factors that go into it, and those are some of the things that we consider.
That's great, Riley. Maybe a kind of an add-on one to that is if a neighborhood identifies additional roadways that weren't identified in Denver Moves, but maybe an additional one that should be looked at for a bicycle facility, how do you do that? And is that part of this process?
Yeah, so we are certainly open to that feedback. Denver Moves is meant to be a living plan. That means that we can add to it as needed, and so we certainly welcome that kind of feedback, especially again if there is a community desire for bikeway improvements on a street. We want to hear that, especially because you as the community members are out there and experiencing these streets every day, and that's important for us. So that's important for us to hear.
Great, thank you. So there have been a few additional comments on locations where crosswalks are needed. So thank you for sending those in. We'll make sure we note them as we move forward with the design. And also thank you for your civil discourse on the, merits of some bikeways outside of the projects that we're looking at. We won't cover those in the Q&A, but we recognize them and we're reading them. So I think with that, we will go ahead and move on to the project timeline here. And I think Riley's going to cover that one.
Yep. So just to let everyone know, we've kind of talked about how some of these projects were identified quite a while ago, back in 2011, and then through our various planning processes, whether that be Blueprint Denver or the Denverite process, some of those were confirmed through that. Some of these were also kind of reconfirmed in the 303 Art Walk as well. So kind of going fast forward to where we're at now in 2021, again, because the project or these streets have the opportunity to be repaved, it's an opportunity to implement these projects. Where we're currently at is what's called an educate and understand meeting. And so that means for us to kind of share what the projects or what the streets are. And it's really an opportunity for us to hear from you. So you'll notice that at this particular meeting, we don't have designs that we're sharing because by and large, we still have to go and design these projects. So this is really for us to hear from you and make sure that as we're working on the designs, understand if there's anything, whether it's related to biking or speeding or crosswalks or those kinds of things that we should be considering as we're going to, as we're working on the designs for the project. So what will happen over the next couple of months is that we will kind of continue working on the design process for these projects that we mentioned today, and then we'll be coming back to you during the spring. I think what's currently shown is May for a design intent meeting, and that's where we'll walk you through what the design of the project looks like, and we'll share how we incorporated your feedback that we heard from tonight and that we'll capture through the survey, and we'll share with you again how we've incorporated that feedback into the designs. From there, after we have that meeting, we'll refine the designs even further, and that will bring us into late spring. And then the goal is to be able to have the design wrapped up so that the projects, as they are designed through this public involvement process, can be installed in the summer of 2021. And I will also note on here that the paving schedule can sometimes change, and so generally the summer is generally when most of the paving happens in the city, but sometimes that can happen a little bit later into the fall. It just depends on the weather and how warm of a fall we have and those kinds of things. So a couple of next steps, as we mentioned before, there is the Bitly website where we have a survey that's open that'll be open from February 24th to March 10th. And that again is bit.ly/North Park Hill Survey. And then we also have a project website where you can find out more information about these projects as well as others that will be repaved around the city. So that's bit.ly. So again, bit.ly/Denver Bike Paving. And also, if you're able to sign up for the office hours with the project team that is shown here on my screen, you can find out, it's a really long link, so I won't read off the whole link, but you can find out how to sign up for those office hours at the bit.ly/Denver Bike Paving Project website that I just mentioned. And then furthermore, you can also contact us at bikes@denvergov.org if you have further questions or concerns. And it's helpful when you email that website, if you put the corridor name in the subject line, and that helps the person that monitors that email inbox to be able to direct those emails to the correct person. So it looks like we're going to pause one more final time for questions. So I'll hand it back to you, Alicia.
Yeah. And I don't think we've gotten a significant amount of additional questions here. I did want to point out, Riley, if you can back up one slide, one more piece, the email box up here in the corner. If you want to get on our email list and you didn't get any of the email information about this meeting to start with, I see already one person has put their email in the chat. Welcome to put your email in the chat or go to that website or send an email to bikes@denvergov.org. And then also in the end of the survey, there's a spot to fill out to put in your email address. And we really do try to focus, the email blasts that we send out to your area. So you can kind of put it in and say my area only, unless you actually want to get emails about all the bike projects going on in the city. So. With that, since I don't see a significant number more questions that we haven't addressed here, do know, like I said before, that we're taking all of the back and forth here into account, and we're going to document them as part of this meeting documentation. A note that a recording of this meeting can be found later. Here's also in the chat is the bit.ly addresses for those one-on-one office hour meetings. So all of this info can be found after the meeting, including the meeting recording on the project website. And just give us a few days to get that meeting recording up. It'll be up a little bit sometime next week in case you want to pass it on to your neighbors. And just wanted to say thank you all for joining us. I know evenings these days are important and wanted to respect your time, give you a few minutes back of your evening. Thanks for joining us.